Welcome to the Sorch podcast, where we explore Sikh and wider South Asian history, art and philosophy with historians, artists and researchers.
How's your daughter? You have a baby girl, don't you?
Yeah.
How old is she, if you don't mind me asking?
She's 2.5. She was born in March 2018.
That's mad.
On Brexit.
On Brexit, that's jokes. That's jokes.
Yeah, and ironically, that sent me here to Denmark from born and raised in Slough.
So is your daughter then Danish by birth?
Yeah, Danish by birth, yeah.
Nice. And so have you changed are you like a citizen of Denmark or do you still own a British passport?
Well, I'm a resident, but I don't have a permanent residency in that respect. So I'm here because I have a full-time salary and that kind of affords me to be here in Denmark. In other European countries, you get this leeway to be a job seeker, right? So for example, you could be in France and spend about maybe 6 months there. In European law, you can visit European countries in the EU for 3 months as a visitor, as a tourist. But if you extend 3 months, then you've got to somehow justify you being there. And it normally comes down to three things. One, you could have sufficient income. So if you've got enough money in the bank, so like £20,000 normally, I think it is. Or I think it's 10. Or if you have a job, a salary, or you have a family connection. And then I had a job, so that justified me being here and living here and paying taxes and all that.
So if Brexit actually does happen, how will that affect you and your family?
Legally standing, yeah, it would affect me quite a lot. But let's be honest, I don't think they're going to be deporting British people out of Denmark or British people out of Spain. You've got hundreds of thousands of British people in Spain and so on in Denmark, and not so much hundreds of thousands, but I think you've got 300,000 in Spain as like retired elders and so on. And I really don't think the government of Spain is going to start to forcefully deport these people. I mean, it's a privilege, right, to be British. In the diplomatic sense, I don't think there'll be like violent repercussions like that. But it does question a lot of stability, in terms of my residency. It does question whether or not I'm legally here, what does happen next. And so far so good. It seems like the British and Danish relationship is quite good, so I think they're on like amicable terms about what happens next to the Brits that are stranded here in Denmark. I don't think it's going to be something I have to immediately worry about, but I think it'll be okay. I've never worried about it since 2016 at all.
No, fair. I don't blame you. I just think that it will be more of an issue for EU citizens in the UK rather than UK citizens in the EU. The only reason I spoke about your daughter was because you mentioned you put her to bed earlier. And I was like, I swear he's about my age. And then I was like, Jesus, man, he has a child. I am the child. I can't have a child as well, right? But equally, my older brother's got 2 little girls. It's indescribable. I'm sure you can appreciate it, like that love.
I think when you have kids, everything starts to fall, makes sense. I don't think anyone's really ready. I think even in that case, let's say, for example, you've got a couple, they get married, they save enough money, they get a mortgage on a house, they do all the necessary things that you think need to tick the boxes. You do all the right things and you get enough money, you put a down payment on the house, you are financially stable, you have everything all in place at the right time and everything, all the things that you can imagine. But the moment the baby is born, that's when the real test starts. And I don't think anything can prepare you for that. Anything, actually. You can have all those things in place, or just things that you need to handle at the time, at the moment, that kind of separates what's a good parent, what's a bad parent.
Yeah, I almost question myself, like, who am I to be teaching a kid anything? But I guess that's also the blessing of having a child.
What you say. If I'm honest with you, so like I've got a 2.5-year-old now, and she's at this age now where, that was 2.5 years. And consider the 9 months that she's in, her mother's stomach. So you got 9 months there, 2.5 years. So that's like what, almost, let's say 3.5 years. And so I've had 3.5 years of me knowing I'm going to be a dad. Now, in those 3.5 years, you can learn how to cook. You can learn a life skill. You can learn something that you can traditionally pass on to your daughter. If you don't know Punjabi and you're not literate, you can do that in those 3.5 years. By the time your daughter's 3 years old, you could be equipped with what it takes to, pass on that knowledge to your daughter. You could lay the foundations, lay that kind of infrastructure in her life to set the ball rolling. Like, for example, now I've got a 5-year plan.
Yeah.
What do I want to pass on to my daughter? I know Punjabi. I would say I'm mediocre at Punjabi, but I'm not an expert in Punjabi. There are words now I've had to use every day in order to advance my Punjabi, to learn for my daughter. So, for example, like she says in Danish, I have to say as a parent, something is dangerous. They're farli, which means it's dangerous. So don't go near them. But I'm like, how do I say that in Punjabi? एक खतरनाक है, or खतरनाक लोग है, or एक खतरनाक चौंक है, like on the roads or the crossing. But that doesn't really naturally fit. It doesn't fit. It doesn't normally flow. You would say something like sat lag jani, or something like that instead. So I've had to really learn the words that I've never really had to know before, everyday use. For example, khargosh as a rabbit, because that's a favorite animal.
Yeah, but khargosh is a badass word though.
It is, yeah.
But I guess this is the thing, because we don't necessarily talk it day to day, and so I guess you're not like exposed to the expanse of vocabulary that you would need.
Yeah, but that leads me back to my point, right? Because my daughter's 3.5 years now, so I think I've got cooking down to a T. And my Punjabi's mediocre, like in terms of like, above average. And then something I feel confident to pass down, but something I'm going to be advancing in the next 5 years, so that when she's 7 and when she's 8, I'm going to be sitting with her, reading and writing like things from this Pradesh and other Punjabi sources and stuff like that. I've got 5 years until that day happens, until when she's 7, that she can sit by me or on to the side and read something and write something together and do homework on that. Even if we started at 6, that's 4 years away. I've got 4 years to do that, right? And I think, passing on knowledge or intergenerational knowledge like that, especially when it's culture, heritage, and Punjabi language or anything like that you feel like has a significance or importance that you want to impart on your children, it doesn't start from day one. For the first 9 months, they do nothing, right? They lay on their back and they want milk and they sleep. They sleep, they want milk, and they lay on the back, and maybe they'll start eating solids. But there's nothing substantial that you can really do until the first 9 months or even the first year, right? And I think that's really important. And it also ties into Sikh Archive. I mean, we'll talk about that later, but it is a lot of this significance. It's interesting that you start this conversation about having a child, because that's when those identity crises or that kind of like pivotal turning point start to come to fruition about what is my identity and how do I pass on this legacy of who I am, my heritage, my culture, my people, my ancestors and all that. Even through recipes, the only reason I'm learning so many Punjabi recipes is that my daughter can associate what her dad's food is and who her dad was.
Just like a random fact on Punjabi food, did you know tomatoes are not native to India?
Yeah, I know that, yeah.
And they were introduced by the Portuguese in like the 1500s. Like, I know it sounds really stupid, but how shit must have Turka been before the Portuguese turned up?
It's funny you say that, because, there are recipes without tomatoes. And even what is tomato in Punjabi? It's tomato, right? So it's like one of those things where you say to yourself, what is Punjabi? What is the construct of Punjabi? Where do these recipes come from? What am I technically, authentically teaching my daughter here, right? But there are some good torkas you could do with dain, with some marinated dain that you can do. You can also do it with I think coconuts and mangoes.
No, you are right. I appreciate you can make torka with coconut or mangoes. Personally, I absolutely detest coconut torka. It is grim, to say the least. However, just bringing the conversation back to tomatoes and torka and how that is almost synonymous with Punjabi households and Punjabi culture. And actually, when we look at it, it's a hybrid or a result of a number of different cultures.
That's what all these things are, right? Culture and identity formations. A lot of these are amalgamations of everything else. There's nothing really exclusive about it. So say, for example, like even Punjabi, I'll give you an interesting example, right? Personal anecdote. I've got a Punjab tattoo, the map of Punjab as a tattoo on my chest, right? I got that when I was 17. And obviously I feel like I'm the coolest guy in the world, right? Like, obviously then I come to realize, I've come to age of reading into these things. I'm like, hang on, this Punjab border is today's Punjab border, but then what tattoo should I get? So I've been thinking for the last few years, should I redesign this tattoo? Should I redraw it? Should I get the full butterfly of Punjab? And then I had to design a map for Punjab for this Sikh museum in Denmark, and trying to explain this Punjab map. And then I came to the realization only then in 2019, I was like, oh, hang on. This is the British construction of Punjab, or, those borders. And then I'm like, well, what should I, what should I do? Should I fade? Should I do like a faded part of Kashmir? Should I do a faded part of like Balochistan? Should I do a faded part of like, Rajasthan, and these kind of faded things just to show that these lines are blurred, and it's just interesting, I mean, even Punjabi speakers, we have Afghani Punjabi speakers, we have Kenyan Punjabi speakers.
Yeah. Now, what I'm going to take from that and say for later on when we talk is about how actually within that conversation, there's almost like a tug of war between like an exclusive Sikh identity and a Sikh identity that is like a hybrid of numerous other identities. And what I mean by that is, and I think a really easy way of explaining it is if you ever look at Jawala's Twitter,
you will notice how beautifully and how eloquently he often explains certain parts of Gurbani or Sikh history with reference to the wider cultural or historical or religious influences that help to create the particular text or part of history that he's examining. And quite often when he tweets these gems of information out, there's usually someone in the thread or in a reply below saying, you're making it up, it's your own interpretation, where are you getting this from? An example being, yesterday he had posted about how there were references to Hir Ranja in a particular text Guru Gobind Singh Ji had written, and someone was essentially questioning how could you come to that conclusion. However, what's more important for the purposes of our conversation on this podcast is that those tweets and those exchanges that often happen on those threads illustrates this tug of war between an isolated religious Sikh identity and then a Sikh identity that has been constructed and is informed by the wider cultural, historical or religious influences that have helped to construct it. I can see and I can understand why the kind of the former identity exists. Like, I get it. The latter identity, though, is more liberating because it actually goes to paint a bigger picture. It gives you a bigger canvas that you can look at and go, oh yeah, that makes a whole lot more sense. Like, for argument's sake, why is Guru Gobind Singh Ji writing in Persian? Why is Guru Gobind Singh Ji writing in Farsi? Like, as in to a strictly Sikh identity that is non-Sikh in a modern sense. But actually then when you look at it in the sense of, well, actually the language of all the royal courts at the time was Persian, and actually Persian had been ingrained in Indian society for hundreds of years, then you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Obviously Guru Gobind Singh Ji is adopting and evolving those royal institutions to being a distinctively appropriating them and evolving them into a Sikh form.
Yeah, I mean, Persian was the currency back then. I mean, both like literally and culturally, and how to navigate that society. And I think
completely. And there was nothing Islamic about it either. And what I mean by that is, like, so a modern sense that we have, especially after the British really forced upon this idea of one nation, one language, and all the rest of it. We always see languages. So like we see Hindi as belonging to Hindus and Punjabi belonging to Sikhs and Urdu belonging to Muslims. That just wasn't the case back then. Hindu Rajput kings were using Persian. Pretty much all of India was using Persian. If you read Eaton's book about India, it's some of it obviously that I think has pitfalls, but a lot of it is really good in terms of explaining that wider context and actually mapping out that Persian world that existed in India. Agreed, there is an Islamic context to it, but it's not Islamic in the sense that we may interpret in terms of, I don't know, like ISIS.
I see what you're saying, and I think, what we're really discussing here at the root of things is, the codification of Sikhi, when do things become axiomatic, right? Like such that this is the case and it follows, and we started to draw these kind of deductions or kind of definitional constructs of what it means to be a Sikh. And of course, I feel like that has become the root of all conflicts in the last at least couple of 100 years.
Would you like to please introduce yourself, where you come from, who you are, and just a little bit about your upbringing? Usually it's really good to start with kind of where your parents come from, where your grandparents have come from, because most of us have quite extraordinary stories about how our parents ended up or grandparents ended up wherever they did.
As far as much as I know, that our family on my dad's side come from Lailpur, which I also discovered is not the original name. I think Lyle was a general in the British, and so they had named Lailpur after that, and now it's called Faisalabad after the creation of Pakistan. So my dad's side come from there, but even then, I believe they come from Amritsar before Lailpur, going way back. And the reason for that was there was some incentives. A lot of people from Amritsar or Gurdaspur had gone to West Punjab, or they didn't call it West Punjab, but had gone to the west side of Punjab around Lailpur for agricultural reasons. There was incentives. There was irrigation projects. There was kind of, land giveaways. What would you call it? Yeah, so a lot of people had these schemes to kind of establish the agriculture there under the British and so on. So a lot of people that say they're from Lailpur or Pakistan have actually before that had come from around Amritsar region and so on.
Can I ask you how you found that out?
I found that out through reading books on this topic on the agricultural landscape of Punjab, and just reading about the internal migration of Punjabis in Punjab, those that go from east to west, especially some books that reference are based on partition, that speak about how many Punjabis had to go from west to east. A lot of them reference this history prior to that, about when some of the Punjabi Sikhs were going from east to west. Even prior to that, there was like a book by Professor Karen Leonard called Making Ethnic Choices. In there, she kind of details the agricultural landscape of Punjab, its historical landscape, because she documents the lives of Punjabi Sikhs who went to California to establish the irrigation imperial valleys in California, as farmers and as developers. And also similarly, there are similar Sikhs in Australia who are brought there to, develop and establish the agricultural landscapes. These are in colonial times. So we talk a lot about kind of Sikh migration and, why are the Sikhs in England and Canada? Oh, because they were soldiers. Well, they had military migration as well, but there was also agricultural migration. Punjab is the agricultural hub of Asia, especially because you've got PAU, Punjab Agricultural University. It disseminates so much knowledge and research on these things. These are expert farmers that go to colonial white settler territories like Australia, like Kenya, and Canada, and the west coast in the Imperial Valley, and develop the agriculture there as agricultural experts. Kind of similar to how maybe in 100 years' time now we'll say, why are so many South Indians in Europe? Because they were pumping out these IT centers and IT servers and experts on programmers and coders, and that there was such a demand for to develop the kind of colonial states. And so I'm making a huge assumption here as to why my family were in Lailpur. So it's based on an assumption, but it's a strong assumption.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. The only reason I asked is because you said it with so much confidence in relation to your family. I was like, I wonder how he found out, because I partly restarted ramblings again because I was actually looking into my family history, and it's proving quite difficult to get any further than my dad's grandfather's father, so great granddad. I can't actually get that far back. I have information about my bind,
but even the information that I do have about my bind, it's been difficult to verify. So I haven't managed to find my bind on maps from, say, the 19th or the 18th century.
Again, I don't actually think, just like you were saying, that the bind that we know now is the original bind of my family, which again complicates things further.
Well, yeah, I mean, even heritage itself, kind of heritage itself is, in terms of family lineage, is a bit of a construct as well. And it's got lots of dimensions of gender and caste. So, for example, this original family, original bin you're trying to track back to is always on your dad's side, right? That's one thing. And the second thing is that
That's also because, though, my mother isn't Punjabi. So if my mother was Punjabi and her parents came from Punjab,
Yeah.
then Tikya, I would also follow her family back. Like, as in, I'm not saying that your point isn't correct in terms of most people will follow their father's lineage back, but because my mom isn't Punjabi,
it's interesting. Yeah.
I've been able to trace her white mother's side of the family back to like 1500. I've managed to go on my mom's father's side, who is Bengali Hindu, back, I don't know, about 4 or 5 generations. However, with just the Punjabi side of the family, it's really, really difficult.
Yeah, I think there's another couple of things there that kind of affect tracing back Punjabi lineage. One is that, it's not written down. And the second thing is that there's a lot of trauma, inflicted on Punjab, not just partition, but, these original people that would hold the accounts and things are literally, these accounts have been not just destroyed, but either missing or something like that. And, bins and villages have been uprooted, several times. And again, there's lots of traumatic history there with Punjab. Lots of things are flooded, literally because of the rivers and so on. The landscape, doesn't allow for such things, and it encourages migration, internal migration. So there's lots of complexity there in Punjab. And even, like I was referring back before about a gender dimension to heritage, there's also this caste idea, class impact, because a lot of things, to actually have a collection of heritage items or storytelling or anything like this, you require storage, something that can preserve artifacts and so on. And there's no room for that back home sometimes. So especially for, lower class or less privileged folk, because it is a privilege to be able to track your heritage quite back. Some people have family heirlooms, and then you think to yourself, there was in a storage box where it was in a secure facility. It wasn't affected by war. It wasn't affected by colonialism or raids or poverty or thievery. It wasn't vulnerable. So, to even have secure assets like that or secure storytelling to preserve that. I mean, if you look at Sikhi as an institution, if you look at Sikhi as like a documentation of history or of the time, we can go back to Guru Nanak and so on. But look how much like effort and jor, like serious amount. We had to have a whole army to preserve the storytelling and history of Sikhs that go back to 1600s. Whereas you could find your mum's side of the family very quickly like that, But do you ever not feel like so far removed? Like if you did find out who your great grandfather was or where he was at a certain point at a certain time, is there ever a part of you that thinks, oh, all right?
I will be completely honest. I actually don't care.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah, I'm really not that concerned who my great, like I'm actually not that concerned who X, Y, or Z is. But as a history student, I find it really interesting. So for argument's sake, on my mother's side of the family, on my nanny side of the family, I can trace some of her ancestry back to one of the biggest glass bottle factories in Liverpool. I know it's a really random fact, but it helps to understand the kind of where you've come from and what you've gone through. And also it makes it pretty extraordinary than the circumstances that had to combine in order for you, or for me in that case, to even be here. So on paper, could you imagine that the great-great-granddaughter or the great-granddaughter of a glass bottle factory worker in Liverpool was going to marry the son of a Hindu Brahmin from Calcutta in 1940-something?
No, I appreciate that. And that's one of the reasons why I know we wanted to discuss this later, but it actually draws me to the importance of, I learned a lot of these things and this kind of outlook on things when I was documenting the Sikhs of Denmark, and it really became clear, for example, which families could go really back a long time. And, military service as well allowed for people to have storage again and access to photos and letter writings and that allows you to take you back.
And just bringing that background to yourself, we kind of went off on a tangent and kind of got into the deeper, juicier bits. But just coming back to you in terms of like your family, your upbringing, and where you come from.
Yeah, I'll give you a fun story actually, just because you were talking about, you know, who's who and how did they get them. Interestingly, so Joe, just before I do that, I just wanted to say that that's one of the reasons why I think military history and record keeping is just so great in its kind of, you know, how prolific it is, because it's got that access to data, it's got the record keeping, it's got that kind of security, it's got that protection, it's got that legacy, it's got that kind of political and national will to kind of, and funding to keep those memories alive. Whereas not everyone wants to hear a story of a peasant farmer that kind of, I don't know, had got married to his sister's best friend and then migrated because his kid got flooded. And these stories are just kind of they don't have that kind of social capital or historical record keeping capital as much as maybe historical, like record keeping on military migration does, and so on and so forth, in terms of the national projects of, I don't know, integration and things like that. So again, there's so many things there, these layers of dimensions of history, record keeping, that kind of historical return of value, I guess, you know. But sorry, back to the about me and this and how I got here. Interestingly, my grandfather, my nonna, my mum's father, was in Singapore, and I think during the Japanese occupancy as well. And there was a curfew around that time, and they couldn't send letters back to Punjab. So he had got married to this lady in Punjab, and he's gone to Singapore, and he's writing letters back to Punjab, and they don't hear from him for many months, and they just assume he's dead. So they married his then wife to his brother, but then he comes back to Punjab, my nonna, and says, "Oh, look, I'm alive."
I don't mean to interrupt, but is this a genuine story? Because this actually sounds like Bollywood.
Yeah.
This is mad. Sorry.
Yeah. So he comes back, and then he marries my nanny, my current nanny. And had that not been the case, had they not thought he's dead, had the Japanese occupancy not happened, he would not have met my bibi, who would have obviously had 5 children, one being my mother. More interestingly, she would not have had Ravi Singh Khalsa Aid. So that's my mama, and that would not have unfolded had it not been for the Japanese occupancy, and so on. All these kind of random chain of events that have been so globally impacted in the genealogy of the family. Who knows, I could have had a different nanny. Who knows, I could have, you know, a different chain of events, and how influential the military migration and all these things were at the time.
I like that. I like how you took the macro history and brought it right back down to that micro history. What about you then? So obviously we know a little bit about the complexity of your parents' background. So what about yourself then?
So I'm born and raised in Slough. You know, Slough, known in England to have the largest Sikh population in England. And I obviously don't realize that when I'm born and raised in Slough. I don't realize that significance when I'm there. I just think Slough's like every other place until you cross the motorway and you go to Eton or Windsor, and you're like, okay, Slough's not like every other place, you know. And then I'm growing up there, Punjabi, British, kind of the identities that carry you. And none of these things really played a part, I guess, until you go to university, you know. Those things kind of, these identities and so on really crystallize, because then it becomes a stark contrast between, you know, who you're sitting shoulder to shoulder with around the country, and how diverse people come from different backgrounds. And then you start to kind of have these introspection about who you are and whether or not the way you were raised or you're born and all these things are the norms, right? And then you start to like kind of, again, introspect yourself quite a lot.
Do you then say that secondary school, primary school was easy runnings, as in you didn't actually question any of this until you got to university?
No, nothing.
Okay.
And even in university, I was just being myself, and I carried myself through that pretty well and just did okay. It started to kind of come to fruition, a lot of these kind of further readings and critical thinking about identity formations and all these things a little bit afterwards, because and then I've got a maths degree as an undergraduate, and so I only did maths because I was good at maths. You know, when you and here's another thing I realized when I moved to Denmark. In England, compared to the rest of the world, we get really rushed to go to university. Like, we get really rushed. You know, you got people who are like 28, 29 that say to themselves, all right, cool, I'm going to go do an undergrad, like in Denmark and other places, in Sweden and so on. And even in America, I think they start their undergrad around like 21, right? We start our undergrads. 17-year-olds can start their undergrads, you know, technically. That's probably the youngest you can be an undergrad. And you're expected to get your master's and PhD by around like 23, 24. Like, we get really rushed. And I think, obviously, when you leave and you start to realize that another world is possible, and, you know, it doesn't really have to be that way, but then it's too late by then. So I only did maths at university because I was good at maths, and I was really pushed to go to university. Like, you know, when you're young and 17 and 18, you're doing your UCAS applications, and you're like, okay, look, I can't get the only A level I've got like an A star in, or A is like maths. So like, I better just go do maths at university. It's not that I didn't enjoy it, but it's what I did for 3 years. And then straight after that, I knew in the third year that I wanted to apply for law. I realized there was a course called the GDL, Graduate Diploma in Law, which gives you a law degree in the space of 1 year. So it's a fast track and it's incredibly intense. And I did that, and I did pretty well in that. But it was really intense, but it really injected this kind of consciousness about how like society functions, the politics of society, the legal mechanisms, the legal constructs of our society, how we are governed, and all these other things, and all these disparities in societies. And I became really, you know, aware, you could say. And then I started to do a lot of further reading on that, and committed a lot of reading into things like wealth inequality, critical race theory, legal history. And obviously that leads to colonial, you know, our whole legal system is a colonial remnant, right? It's our whole entire legal system is it's a remnant of colonialism.
Would you then argue that, for argument's sake, a Greek or a Roman sense of legality is distinctively different to a colonial sense of legality? And if so, how?
I mean, when I'm referring to like colonial legislation, I'm talking to things like with reference to what affected India and Africa and so on, and Asia and Africa. So, for example, maybe colonial legislation on homosexuality, legislation on census building, or, you know, identity, religious formations, and even the most important one is the Land Alienation Act, you know, of Punjab, and the privatization of Khet, and this debt farming that has been affecting Punjab. What we're hearing in the news lately is a legacy of colonial legislation that inflicted Punjab. So it's all pretty much interconnected, and it's some of the realizations I'm coming to with this further reading when I was doing my law degree.
Okay. So what you're actually saying is that it's the colonial constructs of legality and the remnants that are left over, which have been inherited in the various colonies, rather than the entire system itself. It's always good to clarify what we're talking about when we're having these discussions, and especially for everyone listening. Just to move on then, when I had announced that we were having Sikh Archive on the next podcast, I was sent a number of questions, mainly asking, why are you particularly left-leaning?
Well, yeah, and also but also like the judiciary, the police force. I mean, even, you know, there was no Punjab police before, you know, back then. When did the Punjab police become established as an institution? You know, who were the people? Even if you think about policing, and its origins and so on, when did it come to Punjab? You know, people think it's normal and it's always been there, but there wasn't. You know, what is Punjab policing? Policing is obviously the implementation of the law, and this judiciary and the courts and kacheria and all these things that, you know, that lots of these things are also legacies of colonial systems of governance. And what I mean by colonial, maybe I should use the word foreign, you know, in with reference to Asia and Africa and so on. There's a really good book, a nice fiction with Chinua Achebe called Things Fall Apart, which kind of really explains how, you know, they start off with the churches, then they start these courts, these artificial constructs of legislation, of power, and governance. These things are really foreign to us, you know. We see these kind of discourses take place today in Sikh Sangats that say, you know what, why do we have to resort to going to the police? Why can't we have a Panch Pyare system? All these things like that. And there are other things out there that are alternatives that can, offer like alternative tools of justice, of retribution, and all these things like that.
No, fair enough. The only reason I mentioned the comment in regards to you being left-leaning was because a lot of people would argue that your political views perhaps may influence your interpretation of history. What would your response to be that, if anything?
Yeah, there was a famous quote by Norman Finkelstein, the Jewish scholar, and on Israel and Palestine and so on. And he's a Jewish scholar himself, and his family was killed and tortured and during the Nazi regime. And he's very, I wouldn't say pro-Palestine, but he's really critical of Israel as a Jewish, and he has a really strong voice for those things like that. And he's written some really good books on that, and I highly recommend his work. And he gets cast. He said, how, as a Jewish person, like, how can you not be pro-Israel? Like, why do you, stand for so much things on Palestine and so on? And he says, I'm not pro-Israel. I'm not even pro-Palestine. I'm just pro-justice, And that quote, which I think he said in an interview with Mehdi Hassan, really struck a chord, because it's like, left and right and all these things, whatever you want to describe it. What are you really, criticizing here? So if people are saying I'm leftist and all these things, I'm making those criticisms, yeah, go ahead. I mean, I welcome criticism. It's nothing like that, but it's like, I wouldn't say I'm left or right. I would just say I'm pro-justice. And you got to think to yourself, well, what does that look like, right? What does that world look like where you want to be pro-justice, whether it's economic justice, whether it's social justice, whether it's political justice, whether it's kind of racial justice, whether it's wealth justice? What do these kind of things look like, Even if you, take the context of Sikhi and say, for example, the Anandpur Sahib resolution, a lot of people don't know that it's a proclamation, and it's got resolutions that include things like reparations. So let's say, for example, now, if I make the argument for reparations and someone says, oh, look at this lefty talking about reparations. Reparations is a form of financial justice, right? It's what you've been owed, in the context of Anandpur Sahib resolution, they were talking about reparations for people that are refugees that have suffered partition, right? As a result of like the elite politics of India. And that's a form of economic justice. And this is what economic justice looks like. That's how it's manifested, through the form of reparations. But if I talk about reparations and someone's saying, oh, look at this leftist, or say, for example, even things like healthcare or other left-leaning policies, or what you would describe as left today, what they really just actually are is just pro-justice policies. Even labor rights, labor rights in terms of people's labor justice, in terms of being fairly paid and not exploited, which we know is, a lot of the bedrock principles of Sikhi, and there's so many Sakhis of Guru Nanak that, that kind of illustrate that. If Guru Nanak squeezed two rotiyan, or if someone, did a protest today at Downing Street and squeezed two rotiyan, and it was staged, and there was blood coming out of another one and milk coming out of another one, and we were talking about exploitation of labor and child labor and all these things, those same people would have the criticism and say, oh, look at this lefty, right? And it's like, that's what labor justice looks like. So what do you think economic justice looks like? What do you think social justice looks like? What do you think religious justice looks like? And I think if you use that kind of...
Just a quick one on your point, because I think it's a brilliant example that you've used. Would you say that the fundamental difference between the framework of Guru Nanak Dev Ji and this left-right framework is that actually Guru Nanak Dev Ji's framework is completely self-sovereign in that it's perpetuated by the community? There is no state involvement, quote unquote. However, the left and right system is actually a political system that always is going to involve some form of nation state.
It's also quite new as well. I mean, the right is defined as this, neoliberal free marketplace agenda.
Again, tying into Christianity, colonialism,
yeah, and so on, and these things. And one interest, and the left is obviously again, I would just say what people would like to call the left, no matter what it is. I just think it looks like pro-justice. So if you have an issue with maybe things that are pro-justice, maybe you have an issue with the methodology of things. Maybe you don't agree with the forms of justice it takes or the strategies and so on. But if you generally take a pro-justice view, and then we would kind of conform to what pro-justice looks like. I think a lot of people that maybe criticize me for being maybe too left, either, and I don't mean this insultingly, either have a limited understanding on some things about how it, or not actually don't have skin in the game of how it affects them. You know, like for example, I live on rent, and I stay heavily. I look closely and stay focused on issues concerning rent and renters' rights and landlords and things like that. Whereas a lot of people don't, who can criticize me for taking up issues about landlords and how, you know, the accumulation of private property and houses is causing this huge housing crisis. You know, what are my views on social housing? You know, that used to be the pride of Britain until the 70s, that had been completely liquidated by Margaret Thatcher and this new neoliberal era. But that's a different discussion. But what I'm trying to say is that there are things that certain policies inflict injustice, right? And I think as a Sikh, or at least my opinion of what it means to be a Sikh, is to just see where there is injustice, because that's always going to be either a consequence or an unintended consequence of something. Anyone makes any decision on any grounds, on anything, someone's going to lose out. And it's about kind of minimizing that or mitigating that, is kind of redressing that and saying, look, there was an injustice. India, Pakistan was created and there was a huge injustice. You know, we don't want to go back to a Bharat state, but give reparations to the refugees, give them adequate housing, give them adequate access to, you know, clean water, don't make them live in kind of these camps or refugee camps, or kind of limit or reduce the military controls on their confinements and all these things like that. Give them education, give them kind of, you know, reservations to kind of give them access to social mobility, all these kind of things like that. I think they all look like pro-justice positions to me. And maybe we would be called leftist, or maybe would be criticized for that. But I think, again, getting inspiration from Norman Finkelstein, I'll just say I'm pro-justice. And if you have a criticism about what that looks like, then it's probably most likely comes down to maybe the strategy, or they don't, or they have a limited understanding. And I'm sorry to say that, I don't mean that in an insulting way, or they don't have skin in the game in terms of if they've ever experienced poverty or homelessness, or what it means like to be hungry. You know, take for example the policy that was disputed today, more recently with Marcus Rashford, right? About feeding school children during the break because of the coronavirus. And, you know, I'm having full-blown conversations with Sikhs and other people that, you know, criticizing me, saying, look, you know what, don't just give them handouts. It's not fair like that.
Well, I was just going to actually say, before you brought up the Marcus Rashford thing, which actually ties in nicely, wouldn't you argue that langar is a leftist idea? It's universal right of food.
I think in a grand sense, in a very grand sense, you could say yes, but I think we have to remember that Sikhi became. Here's another thing as well. It's a really important talking point, I think, that I would like to your listeners to know or hear, is that Sikhi came before the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution was like probably the most pivotal and momentous like moments in history that radically transformed our society. So a lot of these things that we currently associate or consider to be left or right is, you know, post-industrial revolution in that sense.
Well, just to add a little bit of historical context, left and right comes from the French Revolution, where they sat on either the left bench or the right-hand side, and everything actually derives from that.
Yeah, I was going to say that. And I think, again, going back to like the 1970s of the neoliberal era with, you know, Thatcher and Reagan, and the liquidization of social housing and you know, the decimation of trade unionism and all these things. So trade unions, again, what is if we got pro-industrial revolution and we got lots of labor and we've got this mass industries that require, you know, coal mining and all these things, what does justice for them look like in terms of their labor, in terms of their income, in terms of their men, and all the kind of efforts that they put in to feed their family? What does justice for them look like? Of course, it's going to be trade unionism, right? You've got to organize, you've got to fight for your rights, you've got to get numbers, you've got to get support, you've got to get leaders, which is basically everything that Sikhs do anyway in the search for justice, right? That's exactly what we do. We gather, we form large groups, we take on the powerful. We do that in some form of unionism, right? So if you talk about trade unionism in terms of what it means to have labor justice, again, lots of people will criticize me being too lefty, but they don't maybe are not understanding or criticizing or looking on a world scale of what that means and what it looks like to have labor justice. So again, Sikhi came way before the Industrial Revolution. And I think, again, about langar. Langar came before the Industrial Revolution. So now we've got poverty on a huge scale, on a mass scale. Well, of course it was back then as well, but now it's more, globalized. And, I think langar as an institution has a philosophy of, everyone has the right to eat, paid in full, everybody eats. And I think that's the core of what food justice looks like. I think, I'll give you an example of this. Maybe I'm going too far on this, but if someone gives a bottle of Coke or Cadbury's or things like that, these corporate products for langar, a part of me feels not disgusted, but I'm like, don't give Coke or Pepsi as langar. Like, please don't do that. Don't donate that. Those things are maybe poison to your children. Langar is the right to eat, and it's about food justice. So everybody eats, you get food justice, but there's also this idea that what we're missing out is that langar offers a lot more. Langar offers it's an institution that offers a lot more in terms of it offers community. There's langar and there's sangat and pangat. The idea of cooking your own food, eating together, washing the dishes together. Langar is a place where debates can happen, discourses happen. We can have radical conversations while eating langar. There's a whole communal impact of that. There's a whole communal recognition of langar, a huge kind of mobilizing of langar that people don't seem to recognize. In terms of what your original question was about whether it's like left or right, I think it's food justice. And what does that look like? Of course, in this current model of economic liberalism and all these things like that, and neoliberal markets, langar is a counter strategy to that. It's not how it should be. There's no privatized mechanism there or what's happening. So it goes against that. So again, to someone, giving free food is not a capitalist model, right? So what is going on? And not to say that langar is free food, but there's no purchase behind, there's no purchase power behind the beneficiaries there. So it's like, what I'm trying to say is that, in that respect, it would be left. There are many things you could, left and right spectrums you can make, but in the economical sense, it's more left than it is right. Let me put it like this, just to wrap this topic up, like on this point. If we never had langar today, and Sikhs today proposed langar, we would be called left. We would be called left or Sims or whatever. We would say, you know what, you're a lefty. We can't do that. We can't afford to do that. It would be beyond our imagination to propose langar. That goes for a lot of things actually in Sikhi. If you were to say, you know what, our gurdwaras, they should have an open door policy, everyone will go nuts and say, you know what, no, you can't have that. We can't have that. Or you know what, let's go back even more, pre-industrial revolution. Hey guys, we're going to start a gurdwara and you're going to be allowed to sleep there. And like, just imagine what those conversations. So housing, why would they have housing rights? There's so much kind of social utility. I mean, even when the last time I went to Darbar Sahib, I went to the top, I went to the roof, and I could see bullet holes and things like that are bullet markings and all these things. And you could go in the Atkal Tak, maybe in a few decades, that would just be inaccessible, completely inaccessible. And then, again, we could look back and someone can say, oh, maybe we should let people in there. And that thought or that idea will be completely far removed from one's memory and say that's just not possible, right? And I think there are two things happening here when people maybe criticize me for being called left and things like that. One is because if we deconstruct the social utility of a gurdwara, we see that it's very much, it serves a social purpose in terms of housing, in terms of being fed, in terms of that social utility of, where and what this means for people. I'll tell you something else a little bit interesting about gurdwaras. Especially in England and in the diaspora, a lot of the first ones were bought in the roughest areas because the land was the cheapest. I mean, if you look at Coventry, I think it's quite close to
Hillfields.
Hillfields, yeah. Listen, that Gurdwara there, Hillfields, right? It's huge. It's a huge industry, but it's in Hillfields. I mean, if you know Coventry, or even you know Hillfields, right? And let me just sum it up for people that don't. Prostitution, drugs, crimes, you name it, everything, right? Everything under the sun. So I mean, and GMP is located at the heart of Hillfields. The point I was trying to make is that Gurdwara can be so big and it can be so astounding is because land is cheap in those places. So that's where that's the trend in most of. I mean, the Gurdwara in Slough is in Wexham. Wexham is a pretty similar rough area, and that Gurdwara could establish itself there. Land is cheap, and you look at the rest of the Gurdwaras in the UK. It's pretty much the same story, and the point I'm trying to make is that these Gurdwaras are at the heart of destitution, right? Lots of poverty and everything like that. But there's this gap, like we have open door policies. We do have a lot of kind of leftist, you could say, like universalism, but we can see how in some respects the doors can be quite closed, And the reason that I say that is, and this leads to my second point, is because we have a lot of communalism, in our philosophies. So I am criticized to be leftist quite a lot because I speak on things that are maybe affecting, Black Lives Matter protesters, or maybe issues concerning police brutality, maybe issues concerning Palestinians in the West Bank and on the Gaza Strip, or maybe Kashmiris, maybe Somalis, maybe Punjabis, or I'm talking about wider conflicts and wider injustices. Again, going back to my original point, I'm trying to look at what pro-justice means and what does that look like. We've got Kashmir and we've got Chhattisgarh, we've got Mizorams, we've got so many parallel histories that run like to the injustice of Sikhs, and what do they all have in common? If you draw the commonalities, you really start to see the structures and the oppressive apparatus of and systems that inflict torture, inflict genocide, and so on. And I think part of the criticisms that gets directed my way is because maybe I'm not talking on Sikh matters enough. Maybe I'm not, I'm diverging into other realms or other conversations.
So quickly, again, and I only want to interrupt you just before we move the conversation on further, is because an interesting point you made there, and again, it ties into what we were talking earlier about the example that we were talking about on Twitter about kind of this reactionary Sikh identity that wishes to remain completely exclusive and isolated from anything else. And I think you've kind of touched upon it when you're saying that a lot of the criticism in relation to you being left or whatever is actually in relation to you not necessarily focusing as much on Sikh matters, quote unquote. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, take for example Kamala Harris, right? Kamala Harris, who just became vice president of the United States of America. She's got a huge criminal record. Like she was a prosecutor in California, and there are countless cases where she's either withheld evidence or detained people unfairly, or innocent people detained and like ruined their lives, hundreds and maybe thousands of young black men and so on. That doesn't really reach the radar of Sikh Twitter or Sikh Instagram. So when I raise that kind of point, I get accused of being a leftist. But the thing that does explode on Sikh Twitter and Sikh Instagram is that Kamala Harris denied a Sikh prison officer or something, or to keep his dari, and that just exploded. And you think on the levels of injustice, yeah, of course, everyone has the right to kiss and all these things like that, but there is a grand project here of an injustice, and this is really interesting because Akal security, I did a lot of research on this in terms of where their money was going, who they were connected to, which
it was set up by Yogi Bhajan originally. I didn't actually know that until researching for the podcast last week when I spoke to Shabad.
Yeah, Shabad's a good guy. In going back to that point about Akal security and Sikh identity, a lot of people parade that, they parade the Sikh identity. They parade the fact that we've got Sikhs in the military, we've got Sikhs in the US Army, we've got Sikhs in Akal security. And then I didn't break the story. I kind of just researched quite a lot into it and did some freedom of information requests and all those things like that, and learned a lot. And was in touch with many librarians, and when I say librarians, I mean researchers who have access to lots of databases and records and so on, and dug a lot in terms of their connections and how entrenched they were in the Trump regime and their association and contribution to ICE, which was the immigration service that is like controlling the children in cages on the borders and so on. And what I'm doing all this research and I'm sharing this, and everyone's saying, you know what, they're Sikh. So I kid you not.
They're Sikh. Don't say anything bad. How dare you?
No, it gets worse than that. I got a worse example. Someone said, no, but it's a good thing because if they have Sikhs, then the security staff will get Jatka from Hazur Sahib to feed them. Someone said that.
Sorry. I need to gather myself before I ask you to repeat what you just said. Sorry.
Someone said that, don't you think it's a good thing that we have Sikhs as security guards? Because these Sikhs are everyday armed bandit, American people who are the guards. They have no association. So, but a lot of the Sikh Twitter and Sikh Instagram was saying, no, it's ethically correct that we have a Sikh, company in controlling the borders. Again, borders really modern. Yeah, controlling the borders of American, and on the whole, you can't really win the Sikh voice on that. People are going to accuse you to be a lefty, and you say, look, the reality here is that we've got a Sikh company that is, and no matter how much you want to say they're not Sikh, that's irrespective of the point. We have a Sikh company that is administrating violence, horrific violence, rape, torture, child separation, deportations, incredibly violent things, and it's paraded as Sikh, and I think that is enough to kind of warrant its existence, which is kind of terrifying of what this means for the future in terms of Sikh identity. This is identity politics. Everything is identity politics. If you say you're British, that's identity politics. That has a huge undercurrent of violence that administers that identity. I think people associate identity politics with the left and say that identity politics is this, it's that, it's so left, you're such a kind of leftist. And I get accused of these things. The same people that maybe accuse me of being too leftist, right? There have been conversations that are really concerning. Again, the Marcus Rashford one. If anyone doesn't know, people who are listening from abroad, England had a policy not to feed school children, during the holidays, during the pandemic, which is really unfortunate because it was given to them before and it got taken away from them for the half term or the autumn break, and now the Christmas holidays and so on. So a very famous footballer fought for their right and basically pushed the government to fund this bill, right? That would feed children.
It's probably important to add that he's quite a young black man.
He's 23. Man. Yeah, he's 23. Yeah. He was raised in poverty himself, so he knows what it's like to be hungry. Again, this goes to and it's very alarming. How can you be against such a position? How can you argue against feeding children? And that again is food justice. And if your stance on that is in opposition to such a policy, you really got to question, forget this whole lefty righty thing. What does justice look like?
So I was just going to add to that for argument's sake, I think it also comes down to your perspective / ethos. The idea of Sarbat Apala is just never ending, in that no matter what we are praying for or what we are asking for, however you want to define it, we are always asking for the benefit of absolutely everything and anyone. Yeah. And on the flip side, again, if you're not blessed with that quite unique Sikh understanding, I don't think you kind of naturally just take to it. Modern society is actually just angry. And I think, in all fairness, a lot of the reaction to it is emotional rather than actually rational. Because actually, rationally, when you think about it, why wouldn't you want your government to feed starving kids?
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that. I mean, there are countless examples I could give. I could explain, or I could discuss policies or things that concern government policies again on deportations, incredibly violent, horrific acts of torture and so on. And this extends to a lot of other things. How do we apply Sikh philosophy or Sikh principles of justice in where we can identify injustice? And injustice extends way beyond just the Sikh Sangat, and globally speaking, on the world scale, what does where do we see injustice, and how do we respond to mitigate that injustice? We know there's going to be injustice, but how do we kind of address that? Whether it's, I'll tell you one thing, that if we want to talk about history, especially, because obviously that's the context of and the backdrop of this conversation, because, I administer the page Sikh Archive and so on. Even when we look at something like historical justice, now, if we look at historical justice, if we have a British colonial reading of Sikh history, we go up in arms about that, right? We say, no, it wasn't like that. That's not the case. We challenge it. We form institutions that kind of redress those injustices. We say, no, we will make universities. We would produce like academies, scholars to kind of say otherwise. We would kind of do a huge campaign to find out what justice is. When people say Bin Laden was a terrorist, and this is a historical, not just historical inaccuracy, but a historical injustice. It's a misrepresentation of our history. If you say, for example, all these other things, then we respond to that and we say, hey, I'm going to try to achieve justice here and correct or reformulate what you're trying to say. Or we have a battle of narrative that takes place. And of course, we want a just narrative to triumph. And I think if we can see parallels between the zealous Sikh Twitter or like zealous Sikh Instagram that wants to achieve historical justice, just try to extend what that means in terms of the economic sense, political sense, social sense. And, and it will start to crystallize, it will start to realize that actually what I'm saying, or it's not entirely, it's open to criticism, but this idea of just throwing the word, you're a lefty or this and that, it doesn't really hold much water, Yeah, so what I wanted to say on your point there was that, again, going back to this whole idea about left wing and right wing, I think, when we discuss issues about racism, and we get one person saying they're a racist or they have racist viewpoint, and another one has an anti-racist viewpoint. We live in this world where what is the right thing to do is consider their opinions 50-50. And I think that's really wrong. I don't think that we should, equally weigh this idea that someone wants to kill you because of the color of your race and someone wants to just live free because of the color of race. It's not, these are not all equally weighted considerations of society. It doesn't work like that. And I think that's where this whole left wing and right wing things falls into place as well. I think that contributes to it at least. And this idea about, the construction of a military identity in a Sikh, I think Shabbat had a really good answer on your podcast last week where he said, individually speaking, that these people are symptoms. Individually speaking, these people are symptoms of the system. They are either there because they're economically compelled, maybe through poverty, maybe through lots of debt because of agricultural rights and so on. Lots of other things about, if you were the first son, especially the division of Khet in Punjab, which was a big thing. If you were the first son, maybe you would get Khet, you would get the rights to the land. And then if you were the second child, you would become a police officer or join the military. And then if you were a third one, maybe you would migrate. And this led to a lot of migration. This led to a lot of enlistment in Punjab to become either a police officer or a military. Those are pretty much your two secure forms of income and life choices. A lot of the life choices in Punjab for young men, and again, it's a legacy of British colonial systems. But so again, individually speaking, a lot of these people are economically or maybe politically compelled and so on. No one really makes a free choice anyway. And that's another philosophical discussion, but no one really makes a free choice. There's no such thing as, a free choice. But what I was trying to say is that individually speaking, Shabad makes a good point that these people are just symptoms of the system. So there's no individual criticisms per se, but the systems itself are incredibly violent, incredibly oppressive. And we are training people to kill innocent people. That's what the military does, and I think a lot of those things are far, far, far removed. If you showed a Sikh guy wearing a firefighter uniform, you would feel proud. He saves innocent people, and you think, if you show a doctor wearing, if you show or parade a Sikh person as a doctor, you say, what, this guy saves lives. He changes and fixes people's hearts. He can maybe be a brain surgeon. He makes sure that they have a secure way of living, But if you show a Sikh person in a military uniform, nothing really comes to your mind. You get this kind of blank, empty void, and you think, you just have this sudden vacuous, sense of pride.
Well, it depends. I would again.
Let's say the.
For argument's sake, I personally would find it quite conflicting. I find it really interesting when I'm finding images of Sikhs within the British military or whatever military is fighting in all these historic wars. Going back to Shabad's conversation last week, he made a really good point about how kind of the First World War is basically the result of Europe being...
Yeah, it was a battle of African colonies.
Yeah, and kind of this essentially a family feud. And then how the Second World War was slightly... Again, I kind of challenged it slightly by saying I think Hitler pretty much turned colonialism into Europe in terms of he was finding Lebensraum for Germans. He was doing what all the Europeans were doing, but he was doing it within the confines of Europe, which for them was like how dare you. But then again, I think on the individual basis, you start to question the systems that put those people in those places, why they made those decisions. Again, another interesting thing which I've been reading into a lot about is how, especially Heather Street's book, about how Sikhs were, I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying manipulated, but they were essentially marketed very cleverly in order to drum up further numbers, again, to wage colonial wars. These Sikh, and I think I get a lot of beef for this, and I'm sure you do as well, but they weren't fighting their wars. So for argument's sake, I'm sure everyone's heard of the statue they're going to build in Wolverhampton of a Sikh soldier. And at first, when I read it, I went, well, okay, it will do a lot for the image of a Sikh within Britain. On the flip side, I also think that it commemorates a very particular image within a very particular space for a very particular audience, which I think is kind of diametrically opposed to what it means to be a Sikh. And I think, again, when you see images of Sikh soldiers pre-colonialism, so some early photos by, for argument's sake, Felix Beta of Sikhs who fought in the mutiny against the British, you're kind of like, damn, he had balls the size of elephants. Again, it comes down to your historical interpretation and what you think is correct or incorrect. But I think that use of the example of looking at a Sikh soldier is quite poignant way of illustrating the point that actually, what does it mean to be Sikh, and how do we interact with these global wider structures that actually influence us on perhaps ways we don't necessarily appreciate?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you. Let's put it like this, right? There are more Sikhs in poverty than there are middle, upper class Sikhs. That's just a fact. There are many more Sikhs that are working class than there are maybe upper middle class or elite Sikhs. And that just generally seems to be the case in most societies and groups and people. But let's look at the Sikhs. But we don't call ourselves a poverty race. We don't call ourselves a working class race. You know, there are more Sikhs who are of lower caste or something like that, you know, but we don't call ourselves a scheduled caste race. We don't call ourselves a Dalit race, you know. There are more Sikhs who are, I could give countless examples in terms of, maybe there are more, let's say, for example, in a world, for argument's sake, there are more Sikh women than there are Sikh men. We don't call ourselves a feminine race. It's not really a numbers game. It's more about these dominant narratives that continue to exist. This martial idea, this martial narrative, and how this identity was constructed and how it was perpetuated. We don't call ourselves, like, there are lots of Sikh Dalits. We don't call ourselves a sweeper race, even though they have similar migration patterns and similar populations and Punjab and all these things. We don't want to assert our identity to those things because we feel that there's no privilege in that. I mean, you see Instagram and you see all the other things with Sikhs with Bentleys and houses and mansions, and we have these elite CEOs and successful businessmen that are Sikhs and things like this. There are a very minute minority of Sikhs actually have those wealth statuses and so on, but they are the dominant projected image of what it means to be a Sikh, largely because there's an undercurrent there of things such as like integration, things such as an alignment to whiteness and society and what it means to be a good Sikh and all these things. There's so many undercurrents going on there. It's really interesting about what these identities and who these identities are actually serving. So again, if I talk about this gets quite challenged quite a lot because they'll say, no, but you know, in good times we were warriors and all these things like that. But how?
I was just going to add, actually, and I'm glad that you brought this up, but just a caveat, which is, I think personally speaking, I think the martial tradition within the Sikh philosophy ethos, however you want to quote it, is distinctively different to the Sikh martial race theory or the martial race theory and how that kind of incorporates Sikh martial tradition post-colonialism. I think they are two completely diametrically opposed identities, and I think actually the British did a brilliant job at manipulating the former into the latter, because we are still like the conversation that you're talking about is reflective of it. They put these policies in place pretty much as soon as the mutiny kicked in, and obviously they realized, well, from what I've read from the book so far, essentially they realized that they couldn't trust Bengalis essentially or soldiers from Bengal, and looked to Punjab essentially because on the whole, from what they understood, Sikhs just didn't mutiny against them, partly obviously because they didn't want to put another Mughal emperor on the throne. However, it's just interesting to see how deeply ingrained that ideology has become.
Now, this is obviously going to probably be a difficult opinion for people to digest. Again, going back to this idea about what justice looks like and how it's at conflict with the Sikh opinion. But Jugaraj from Basics of Sikhi made a video on YouTube to say, you know, should Sikhs have nuclear weapons? And he said, yep. You know, if Sikhs want to compete on the world stage of global powers and we are our nation, then we should have nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear weapons, the idea of nuclear weapons, again, they came much later than Sikhi. The imagination of nuclear weapons was not available, you know, back then. No one could fathom what a nuclear weapon was capable of. But if you described it, how would you describe what a nuclear weapon does? It indiscriminately kills millions of people. Not only does it do that, but it leaves nuclear waste and radiation for thousands of years that will decay and form deformed innocent babies and destroy civilizations. And this mass degree of injustice encapsulated in this atomic bomb. Why would you endorse that? I find it beyond me. But of course, you know, it's a hard, I can't believe, but it's a hard it's a hard argument to make with maybe Sikh Twitter or Sikh Instagram.
But don't you think distinctively the difference is that we are actually rejecting the nation state system that has been constructed in the modern era? We're actually saying that that system is inherently flawed, and actually the main point is we're just feeding, by, for argument's sake, suggesting we have a nuclear arsenal. We're actually just feeding into the current structure and the current system, which is by default inherently not left wing, because you're not trying to change anything. You're not trying to reform. You're not trying to.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are people that argue with me and say, look, Sikhs in the military or Sikhs in, who have these opinions that kind of, cozy up to the nation state, are actually doing a great service for the Sikh Band in general. Like it's some sort of trickle down Sikh Band, integration, economics, whatever. Like, if we get Sikhs on the inside, or, we want to kind of support the Sikh Band as a community. So, we'll have Harjit Sajjan as the Defense Minister of Canada, and completely relegate his past, to the ash heap of history, because we say, forget what he did in Afghanistan, forget maybe the innocent people or the things that he was trained to do and kill and, confront innocent people and all these things. Just relegate that to the past and say that putting him on the world stage is for the furtherance of the Sikh Qawm or the Sikh diaspora, which has really absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But again, it's this very extrapolated, hyperbolic imagination of the furtherance of the Sikh Qawm and what that looks like. And for me, personally, I just take a pro-justice position, and I want to see what that looks like, And there was an interesting quote actually in the Cynthia Mahmood book where she interviews Kharkus from 1984, and one of them said, one of the questions was, what do you see after you achieve Khalistan? And their response is, well, we would send 5,000 soldiers to Somalia and Kosovo and liberate those people. And I think that's a real internationalist worldview of what it means to achieve justice. Because, whatever people's contentions are with my views, so that's fine, But I sit here at this desk while there are literal war zones going on. There are literal people dying of hunger and poverty. And I think that these comments or these maybe attacks or maybe these criticisms, they are nothing in comparison to what's going on out in the real world, I would say, And I just sit here and I can't take those comments seriously. There's like a wider thing happening outside in the world as we sit there on our keyboards, on our phones. People who are like stranded in refugee camps, people who are stranded, who are starving, who are dying at borders, who are dying in the oceans. And I cannot entertain these kind of debates online, because again, they don't achieve anything. They don't conform to justice, and it's a very privilege to be able to say, oh, look, you're left wing. How can you care about those people drowning, or who cares about bombs are dropping on the people? And yeah, you go ahead and have those opinions, but I can't really entertain or stand them. So yeah,
I think that's a fair retort. I just wanted to ask a couple of things, which is, do you think that the entire left wing, right wing thing within kind of Sikh identity, however you want to define it, is actually more concerned with kind of self-preservation of one's own distinct Sikh identity, however you wish to explain that, in terms of being right wing, and then anything that doesn't necessarily conform to that being left wing?
Yeah, I mean, to try to offer an answer to that question, I think what I go back to is this idea of a lot of communalism in Sikhi, in terms of, if it doesn't affect Sikh people, then it's not an issue, full stop. And I think that's the wrong way to think about things. And then I think by default, a lot of things are relegated or, become by default so-called left-wing things. And, for example, if you've got a Sikh businessman or a Sikh landlord or any of these things, or Sikh person in the military or in a high government position or in a high powerful or influential position in maybe the Trump administration or something like this, we find some way to justify that. And I think criticisms of that are immediately sidelined or discounted as left-wing because they are counterproductive to what the Qawm's interests are in these people's imagination of what it means to benefit or furtherance the Qawm. You know, they say they don't want you to kind of even criticize people like Nikki Haley or, you know, others who are, I can't remember what the other one is called. I think something Dylan. Anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that we would find some long around the house's way to kind of to justify Harmeet Dillon, I think her name is. Yeah, Harmeet Dillon. We would find some roundabout way to justify her position or her arguments as some beneficiary of the Sikh nation. Arguably, that's where they're coming from, and I think anything beyond that is, or anything other than that, is considered left-wing.
Now, I think, again, a brilliant thing that you've just mentioned is the term Sikh nation. And I think that in itself encapsulates everything we're talking about, because personally speaking, I don't think the term Panth translates to the term nation, especially considering the idea of a nation state didn't really turn up until a little bit later, especially in Europe with the Treaty of Westphalia. And I think what you said is it's a brilliant way of actually summarizing this little bit. You encapsulated it brilliantly in that last sentence. So thank you for that. Let's move on. You obviously did a master's degree, which is miles away from anything to do with history. You did a law conversion. So how did you end up going from maths into history, so to speak, and into Sikh Archive?
So yeah, it's pretty interesting because, again, as I mentioned before, that in England, there, and I would say maybe India as well and other countries, there is a huge pressure for people to go to university and study and get a degree as early as possible. And there's a real pipeline of these things, which have a lot of valid criticism. But equally, like in some respects, a lot of, you know, advantages. I would just say that I don't think we can really escape history. And I don't think we have to confront it at some point in our lives, whether it's when the time or the moment that we have kids, or when it's the moment that we have to kind of justify who we are in society or why and where we belong, especially as migrants. So I think history's always been this backdrop in people's lives that we have an obligation to take an interest in, to justify our existence. Again, in particular emphasis on being a migrant or having a migrant heritage, and about knowing who you are and where you come from and so on and so forth. So I think in that respect, it's always been a part of my life. But the reason I started as a blog is just because of this idea and philosophy of having open and shared education. Again, this is about what education justice looks like. A right to education, a right to free education, you know, a right to access to information. I was listening to your conversation about how you were triggered by a Sikh lecturer or a lecturer who'd given a Sikh studies presentation, and you were so scarred by it that you started ramblings.
It was so bad. I wrote like, oh man.
I'm sorry. Trigger. I shouldn't have done a trigger warning.
It's like proper, like as in, when I look back at it, I find it really funny that something as mundane as that lecture triggered the last 10 years, so to speak. But yeah, I guess you don't necessarily realize that at the time, and perhaps actually thank you to him for triggering it, because had his lecture been excellent, I would have gone, that is brilliant, and I don't need to do anything.
Equally for me, it became this idea of historical justice. I think for me, there is a dominant projection of Sikh history record keeping. So dominant largely concerns Sikh military history. And that's obviously understandable because it has the records, it has the political and integration will, and it has all these kind of backings, and it has this support, and it has this kind of huge, you know, mantras that kind of support it. So I think there was a huge dimension of Sikh history, such as migration history, diaspora history, Sikh formations, community building, and oral history, and all these other dimensions of Sikh history that are just so fascinating. And I think my mission or my objective is just just to make them cool again, like not again, actually, I don't think they were like cool before, but like just to make them cool, personalize them, humanize them, and capture the essence of these histories and stories of the Sikhs that have traveled, have walked through Iran and through Turkey, or find themselves stranded. I think there's so much richness in the history of Punjab and Sikh history and Sikh studies that I think is, I grew up in Slough and in Britain, so I find that it's incredibly shadowed, or trumped by this military history. And I think it's a shame because, for one, it's not the dominant, it's not the most popular history in terms of numbers. We have so much other interesting and radical and divergent histories of Sikh, history and record keeping that isn't at the forefront. Things like the Ghadar Party, I think one of the largest international conspiracies to overthrow the British. Great, Sikhs fighting, the Azad Hind Fauj, for example, or the Sikhs, or even 1984 is what it's turning out to be in terms of history record keeping. It's really fascinating and it's really nice to keep up with and see how that's unfolding, and maybe partition history, migration histories, families, personal, again, story building about community racism. That's another huge dimension about anti-racism in the Sikh history. If you look at Blair Peach's funeral from Southall, you see Sikhs holding his casket. So much solidarity there in the 1970s and 80s with the campaign of anti-racism and fascism. Sikhs at the front line of a lot of these campaigns. Is so the working class history of the Sikhs. You've got Makhan Singh from Kenya, the founder of the trade union movement in East Africa. You've got so much radical Sikh history, again, sidelined or discounted. And I think in terms of the justice, what we were speaking about before, whether it's economic, social, educational, political, I think there's a huge, motivation inside me to follow through with historical justice and see, like, okay, look, there is more to Sikh history than this. There is more Sikh history. And I think one of the reasons when I started Sikh Archive, one of the reasons why I think it gained a lot of popularity was I was uncovering a lot of that diversity in our Sikh history, in our record keeping, in our kind of storytelling, which a lot of people felt has been shadowed and I think has been missing in the headlines of what it means to record keep Sikh history. And a lot of people shared that feedback. They said, we don't get to see families, we don't get to hear these stories, we don't get to kind of know what happened or what was happening on migration stories and all these things. We just always hear about maybe Sikhs in the army or soldiers and how that's kind of ticking enough boxes, or and I think in terms of the fight for historical justice with the battle of narratives in trying to represent and document who the Sikhs were and who are they currently, I think there's a lot to be done. And I think I'm just contributing like a small fraction of that in some sense, engage the excitement, engage the kind of engagement with the people, loads of the Sikh diaspora that have these histories to offer, unlocking them, because lots of people don't hold a value in them. Like if you talk to some Sikh women and you say, what were you doing when you came here first? How did you get the recipes? They would say stuff like, we would drive 4 hours to go to Shepherd's Bush just to get a whole month or 2 months supplies of garam masala. In Canada, they would go for days because some of those drives were so long. And of course, we don't hold a lot. And when I say we, I mean, predominantly speaking, we don't really offer or kind of align any kind of social value or historical value to those narratives. But of course, they come to fruition much later when we discuss racism, when we discuss wealth inequality, when we discuss kind of health justice, and when we talk about kind of racial and migration justice, citizenship, borders, migration stories, heritage stories. When we start to discuss all these things like that, these pockets of history that become unlocked have this value. And again, I think for a long time growing up, I didn't really feel that value was adequately kind of, represented. So I think Sikh Archive, what I'm trying to do is, showcase a lot of these histories and storytellings that resonate with the majority, I guess, with the everyday Sikhs, the working class Sikh, the Sikhs that were fighting against racism, the Sikhs that kind of fight for self-determination, the Sikhs that, were arguing for partition, those were that weren't arguing for partition, and just generally trying to, I think what historical justice looks like is to represent a diverse Sikh history. So I think that's what I'm doing and why I was motivated to do that.
Touche. And just then relating that back to your work and stuff, how do you find time to do that amongst having a child, a family, a job?
I think a general answer to a lot of the things that you just mentioned, I mean, I could address them individually, but I think a general answer is, I think when you have a passion for these things, I think when you generally have a drive or an interest or a sincere kind of commitment to this project, I'm not trying to say that you find time. I just say that you have a reserve of energy. I mean, right now it's almost 12:30 here in Copenhagen at night. I've got work in the morning, but there's no part of me that is resisting this idea to do this interview because of X, Y, and Z. I signed up to.
That's because you love me, don't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, who else am I going to be talking to at 12:30 at night on a Thursday? But it's one of those things where it's like it just comes naturally. I don't force myself to do it. I don't have to convince myself to do it. I don't have to, battle myself, inner self, to make me want to do these things. I mean, it's not like the dishes, It's like, I mean, I do the dishes every night. I do the dishes every day, and I do the dishes maybe twice a day. But it doesn't I don't identify it as my passion, right? And I think I have to battle myself to do those things. I have to draw that kind of willpower to do those things. I think with doing stuff like Sikh Archive, all I'm doing is just regurgitating a knowledge. I am actually producing primary work here with the Sikhs in Denmark, but generally speaking, I'm just reading stuff and reproducing it in a way that is strategically aligned to empower and excite and engage others in this subject of Sikh history. And that's actually, again, my passion for education, my passion for teaching and pedagogy, about kind of sharing values, about, passing on knowledge. Back then there was no even such thing as plagiarism. It was just considered sharing knowledge. And I think even, what we currently perceive knowledge to be, how we even private property, even this idea of privatized education and all these things like that, and having paywalls, and it just inherently doesn't really fit well with me. And I think if I buy the book and I can offer everything that it's about, if I do a podcast with the author, and that so you get a good grasp of what the book's about, or what was behind the scenes, what was going on, the amount of effort and value that went behind this book, or the study itself. I mean, those lecture series that I'm doing now at podcasts, my podcasts are more lecture based, right? So they're really driven to just get as much education out of them as possible, so that people can have a more critical outlook on the world of Sikh and Punjabi history. And there are so many other beneficiaries to that, right? There are so many others other than me. If I find it difficult to understand that, even someone like yourself, if you read all these books and you gain all this knowledge, and then what? So what? What do you do with it? That's the most important thing. And I think anything that you choose to do with it, good or bad, I think excites the kind of the engagement of jostling with Sikh history and Punjabi history, and trying to make sense of it, but challenging people's narratives, understanding this. Maybe start anything, maybe start a blog, maybe start a YouTube page, maybe do something, maybe anything that just contributes to the ether of knowledge making, because actually, as someone who's interested in history, every person that speaks of history or documents history is by definition rewriting history, by definition.
There was a great quote, I can't remember who it's by, but it was basically saying that historians simply continue to debate until they come to an agreed set of facts, quote unquote.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly my point. And I think that going back to the original question about, how and find time and all these things like that, I just have a passion for education. I have a passion for Sikhi, and naturally history falls part of that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I also was going to mention that one of the textbooks that we were given when we started our history degree, I still remember the starting paragraph, which was basically saying that every group, every collective has a shared history. However, they don't have a shared memory. And essentially what it's arguing is, for argument's sake, you and I can go through, or say for argument's sake, our families have all gone through some form of migration. And you could therefore argue that obviously their histories are somehow connected. However, then when you break it down, obviously you find out it's just completely disparate. It's all very different. However, I think the great thing with the work that you do with Sikh Archive is that you're bringing out histories from like a collective memory that mainstream Sikh/Punjabi history has, for various reasons, ignored and not paid attention to. So I think one of the posts you put out the other day was about Sikh women in history, and how we're given a very particular image and given very particular examples of Sikh women in history. And I had to comment on it in relation to the fact that I think I think our history is influenced by a number of things. Fundamentally Victorian attitudes. Secondly, obviously colonialism. And then third, everything that comes in the 20th century in terms of World War I, World War II, partition, independence, 1984. I know that's obviously a hell of a lot to try and cram into kind of like 10-second overview. And again, I think just bringing it back to the stuff you're doing, it's brilliant because you're bringing out those memories from those communities that are still there, obviously, because you're able to bring out this information. And then putting that history out to a global audience, and it's amazing to see the impact it has on others. So, for argument's sake, just going back to the one you posted about Sikh women in history, we're definitely given a very puritanical image of how and what Sikh women are. So, for argument's sake, just giving you a quick example, I was reading some Vakil reports from Rajasthani kings around 1708. So Guru Gobind Singh Ji has kind of just passed on. Bahadur Shah, I think, has just died as well. And they're actually talking about, I think, I can't remember whether it was Guru Gobind Singh Ji's mother or Guru Gobind Singh Ji's wife, but one of them had adopted a son called Ajit Singh. And all of the Vakil reports are basically confused because they're like, where has this Ajit Singh come from? They call him the Guru. They're like, where has this Guru Ajit Singh come from that Mata has adopted? Like, what the hell is going on? When you read into it and dig into it deeper, it actually turns out that the Sikh community pretty much ostracized him because he tried to set himself up as the Guru. And in the end, I think, however, that completely, I've never heard of it. Like, until I had read the original kind of source, I never even knew of that. And again, it conforms to a very Victorian, very kind of puritanical view of what and how women should be constructed. And the thing that I really appreciate with the stuff you do is that you bring out those really kind of fine and niche points. So, for argument's sake, Sikh women in history and how, or just women in Sikhi and how that is constructed and how that works and interplays with stuff. So yeah, please carry on with it.
Yeah, I mean, listening to what you were saying is one of the reasons why I'm doing the virtual exhibitions, because with Sikh Archive, I completely chose to wipe the page, and I was wanted to strategize the interface for Sikh Archive to be able to, offer education. Because there was no strategy behind having a picture of a Singh in the 1970s with bell-bottom jeans, and then the next post being something like a Sikh woman being deported from Toronto, right, by the agencies. And I was like, okay, this is not doing it right. We have a lot of history, we have a lot of kind of justice, we have a kind of lot of trauma in these photos and what is attached in the meaning to these histories. And I think, and when I started to do that, and then I did this virtual exhibition on women, Sikh women in history, we were really able to concentrate and focus the attention on the nuances and these niches that you describe, because we had a focus on them, we had a spotlight on them, and we were able to use the collective brain power of the following to advance the discourse on these particular topics. And I think that is what it's about, because I think, and I don't mean to say like what separates me from the rest, but I feel like there's lots of sensationalism online, or the current techniques or strategies that
It's like clickbaiting, basically, is what the internet's turned into.
Yeah, and I think I'm not trying to do that. I think someone messaged me the other day actually and said, hey, you know, this strategy that you have on Instagram, it's not working, it's not great, it's not good for followers and all these things. And I'm like, yeah, I agree. But that goes back to this idea of the reason I wipe them is so that they actually have this essence of value. So that it's like if I was teaching a whole class or I gave a lecture and not a single person wrote something down, how, like physically in the real world, how would you feel? And when you walk away, when that happens, so you prepare this material, you post it, you curate the page, everything like that, and then you get these like hundreds of likes, which you could probably equate to maybe attendance, you know, in a lecture. And then no one writes anything down. There's no discourse. There's no there's no critical discussions there. There's no seminars, you could say, you know. There's no engagement, and you think to yourself, this is just being bastardized, you know, this is being sensationalized, this content. And I felt like that was a huge disservice to our history. And I think, yeah, drawing focus to it, it's counterproductive again to the social media algorithms and everything like that. But then at the same time, I think it's a bigger injustice of what it would mean for the actual content itself. I mean, you're most welcome to screen grab it, copy and paste it, produce a Google document, but the physical action of having to do something about it is part of the learning, is part of the education, is part of the muscle memory. It's like when we make note and we write and we attend a lecture or we do anything like that, the physical act of doing those things, of waking up in the morning, taking your morning commute so you can attend your morning lecture, going to that, you're building and you're establishing a memory, you know, that whether it's muscle memory, whether it's like kind of mental memory, all of these things that contribute to the entire cycle of learning. And I think scrolling your thumb is not pedagogy. I think scrolling your thumb is not kind of, there's no skin in the game. There's no kind of, you know that expression, nothing worth having comes easy. And I think I don't want tens of thousands of followers. It's not that. It's actually more this idea that, look, there are some people doing some really important work that have particular focuses on it. I think there needs to be a particular focus on this. Where we can kind of curate a strategy to encourage genuine listeners and learners to come on board and be inspired by Sikh history. And that's why I think it's working out pretty well. It's working out just fine. I don't think I've had any kind of major drastic changes to like the followers or anything, or the engagement. If anything, it's gone quite up. And I think it's just, again, about having this philosophy of what your content means, what's your end game, and what are you trying to do for the community? What is it that you're trying to achieve, you know? And that's why I do what I do, if I'm totally honest with you. And that's why I'm doing it in that way. And, you know, it was one of the reasons why I've actually come off social media, because you may have noticed that I've started to lend the page out to a lot of people. And I just wanted to actually close on this point about the Sikhs of Denmark research that I'm doing. When I came here to Denmark and I realized that there was a very established Sikh community here in Denmark, I started to document their history, their oral history. I took the images from the photo albums, and I was able to showcase and document the timeline of the Sikhs in Denmark. And that's been a huge, monumental responsibility on my shoulders to be able to tell the story of the Sikhs of Denmark, those that first came, how they came, what their storytelling was, how they established the community, how they responded to 1984, how they responded to 2001, how are they responding now to this kind of, digital era, coronavirus, all the things that you can, post social media, and how did the generations and the families survive. There are countless narratives that I'm documenting. And one of the reasons why I decided to become less and less involved in social media is just because that this work holds more value than having millions and millions of followers because it's, again, vacuous. It means nothing because this is where the real work is happening in terms of archiving stories, in terms of documenting lives, so that hundreds from years of now, maybe 200 years, maybe a Gauri with slightly brown hazel eyes can ask herself, like, who the hell was my great-great-great-grandfather? And then hear his voice by accessing the Royal National Archives of Denmark and learning that, you know, their grandfather came from Punjab. He walked through Iran, Iraq, you know, reading the transcripts of the interviews that I did and looking at the images of when they first came. I think that is more valuable than any kind of social media page or any of these things. And I think the social media pages and these platforms should be secondary to whatever you're doing. It should be secondary. So for example, like if you have a car garage or you're a mechanic, your social media page should be secondary to the work that you're doing so that it kind of supports the primary work that you're doing. And I think as someone who's recording this history of the Sikhs of Denmark, I'm simply just using, like, you know, those podcasts I'm doing, the reason I'm doing them, or the reason I got into doing them, is because I've got all this storytelling, but I don't know anything about the history of Punjab. I am not a historian. I'm not an anthropologist. I don't know anything about migration patterns. I don't know. I've learned a lot on the way, but I didn't know any of these things. So I'm asking people, you know, why did you come from Punjab? Are you the oldest in your siblings? Or are you in the middle? Professor Karen Leonard gave me that guidance because she said, oh, you know, if you find out which order of the family they are, it kind of suggests to you already if they're going to be a migrant or if they're going to be a farmer or if they're going to join the military or the police and all these things like that. And tells you doing a podcast with Professor Radhika Chopra, who described to me about the impact the Green Revolution had, because there's a policy in the Green Revolution that if you have, 5 acres of land or less, you don't really get the privileges of like farmer rights as you did to benefit from the Green Revolution policies, so that they couldn't really divide the kit according to the siblings, so that they really encouraged a lot of migration out. And all of this is happening in the 60s and 70s when a lot of the Punjabis were coming to England and Europe. And then you got to think to yourself like, oh shit, I didn't know any of that. I can't contextualize the knowledge that I'm capturing. So a lot of the podcasts actually just came as actually secondary because it's supporting the work that I'm doing for the Sikhs of Denmark. It's making sense of the caste dimensions, which I was not familiar with. Why are there Ravidasyas in Vienna? Why are there so many Ravidasyas in Vienna, Why are what are the caste dimensions or elements of the Sikhs in Denmark? What are the gender balances? What are the migration patterns? How do they connect with the diaspora? What is the transnationalism? All these kind of terms and theories that you have to kind of help to contextualize this sociological and anthropological study. I have just completely gone into and been, I have dived into. And it's the podcast helped me support that. Conversations like this help me support that. To understand the Punjab political, social, economical history of Punjab, migration patterns, and so on and so forth. And I think that, again, the social media, all of these things just come secondary. And I think I've found my calling in terms of what I can contribute to the field of maybe Sikh studies or Punjabi studies. And I've really kind of realized what matters. And I don't think social media is one of them, but it's important and it really helps to engage, and you can really strategize and facilitate it to be a social utility if you do it well.
Yeah, and I think your point about the fact that the pages should be secondary in terms of the primary work that you're doing, the page should just be simply kind of just spreading the message rather than that being your concern in its primary kind of sense.
Yeah, and I think that's where I really kind of feel really strongly about, if I'm honest.
Fair enough. I completely appreciate that. You must have to get through a lot of material in order to keep up with the work that you do and the conversations that you have, especially if you're talking to people who have written books, doctors, lecturers, etc., researchers. What would you say perhaps is the most influential book that you've read? And secondly, what book are you reading at the moment?
Wow, there are some really, really good influential books. I think The Spirit Level is one of them. It's a good book on inequality. I think Malcolm X's autobiography is another inspirational book. There's a life change.
You know what I find really interesting is that 2 out of the 3 people that I've spoken to so far in this podcast series have both pointed out Malcolm X in one shape, form, or another. But yeah, I love the fact that I'm not the only one.
Yeah, Simulation Simulacra, Jean Baudrillard, postmodernist book about perceptions of reality. It was the book that kind of underpinned the Matrix film, the trilogy. There are a few books that come to mind actually. I think Professor Karen Leonard's book, Making Ethnic Choices, really kind of captured my kind of interest for like Sikh and Punjabi history. What other books are there? I think Harjot Singh Oberoi's book, Construction of Religious Boundaries. I think that's also.
I think that book is just. It is. I don't know how else to explain it to be like. In your emoji thing, there's that little one of like the head explosion. Like that's the only way I can describe that book. I think you have to have a lot of. You either have to be really open-minded, or you have to have a lot of wider. Like further understanding to really get to grasp with what that book is saying. Otherwise, I think you will be very, very kind of upset otherwise.
Yeah, I like The Radical King, which is a collection of essays of Martin Luther King. I think it was compiled together by Cornel West. I like... what is another book that I like? A lot of the books that I read for the podcast are really good as well. Actually, all the authors I would recommend. Annihilation of Caste, Dr. Ambedkar's any work by Dr. Ambedkar is monumental, like highly recommended. Yeah, these are, all the books that I've read for the podcast are also really good. And there's just countless, actually, that I can name. Professor Carmen McLean's book about the revolutionary history of interwar India. That was really fascinating. Really want to discuss that on Discourse with some of the followers of Sikh Archive.
And what book are you reading currently, if anything? Or what was the last book that you read?
I forgot to mention Faith and Nation with Cynthia Mahmood was a good book as well. I'm currently reading the 18th century Sikhs, which is by Professor Karamjit Kaur Malhotra. Really good book, actually explores what gender and caste and what Sikh rule was in the 18th century Punjab, which is really fascinating and that's actually what this current exhibition is on, about how the Sikhs were ruling and how that affected, the gender and caste dimensions under Sikhi.
Touché. And I guess you've kind of answered this question already. I'll ask it anyway. Is there a particular historical figure or is there a particular historical event that you take particular inspiration from? I know you mentioned Malcolm X, but just in order to kind of expand that conversation, like I just wanted to perhaps put him to one side. Is there anybody else?
Yeah, Malcolm X is one particular individual. His autobiography written by Alex Haley was really good and had a huge impact on me. But in terms of historical figures, I think probably I would say Karl Marx. Karl Marx, in terms of...
You leftist.
Yeah, I'm going to really piss off a lot of people. They're going to be like, do you know what? This guy's a leftist, man. You know what I don't get is, when I say that people's criticism is like, for these leftists, he's like their guru. And I'm like, what do you, where does that come from? What is this idea that lots of people say, I don't know if you've heard that as well. People are like, for people like that, that's their guru and all these things. Just to quickly plug in another book, How the Irish Became White by Noel Ignatieff. It's a really good book. I'll just mention it, but I won't go too much into detail. But yeah, back to Karl Marx. I just think he was one of the greatest and radical thinkers and most influential thinkers of our time. especially again, as I mentioned again, post-industrial revolution and his understanding and conception of capital, and how that operates, and what basically things come down to. Can we imagine a world where we have an abolition of private property, and this again goes back to this idea of discussion. It's not about being leftist. It's not about being, it's just looking at a stance of justice. So, for example, I went to Italy and I went to a beach, and I can't remember what it's called, but it was a private beach. And I just thought to myself, how can you privatize a beach? And I was explaining to my cousin, I said, look, this is how it works. Like, imagine who owns an apple tree? Who actually owns an apple tree? That to make the apple juice, like the resources to the world and everything like this actually belongs to the earth and the people and all these things. Like the conception of private property itself, like, when you have like landlords and, and someone says, this is my kid, this is going to piss off a lot of maybe the Jats listening to this conversation, but how can you own land? How can you own a kid? Who was the first person that put a flag down and said this belongs to me because of some entitlement? I think a lot of like social injustices and economic injustices come down to this idea of whether or not, it's a birthright. Caste system is wrong because it's a lottery of when you're born or where you're born or who you're born into. It's a lottery of your birth. Therefore, it's an injustice because it's an entitlement, an enrichment that has not been earned. Similarly, the same goes for like capital monarchy. It's an injustice, but simply because those people are born into it. If you have a birthright to something, that is the core essence of something like that. Is unfair and unjust, right? An unjust kind of philosophy. And I think the same idea of like, private property and those that have and have not an entitlement, private property, and the entire notion of private property and what it underpins is actually one of the main reasons we live in the world that we do. And I think part of the communist and Marxist, Marxist philosophy is to imagine a world, where another world is possible, where we don't have a notion of private property, which is actually quite very, very, very very often found, anthropologically speaking, in loads of different societies. In other worlds or imaginations, that we can relinquish this material attachment to kind of private property, where that is the imagination of Karl Marx, and it's something that I draw inspiration from. And many people might be thinking, again, what a lefty, what a this and that. But if you go through the chain of causation in all kind of conflicts, and in terms of militarism, in terms of private medicine, how can you have even patents, our current whole economical setup, patents, like what a construct that is. Like, how can you have a patent on insulin, or paracetamol, or kind of what is it called? What's the anti-infection one called? Antibiotics, and these things like that. How can you have a patent on these things? Like, how can you have a patent on solar power? How can you have a patent on wind energy and all these other resources? Who owns oil and all these other things that basically what we are battling for, the battle of resources? And yeah, I mean, again, if you want to have a just outlook of the world, you want to kind of inspect it to see what the root cause of it is, and it's basically the notion of private property, I think, and how we view and navigate private property is a real indicator of what we define as justice. And I think that's where I draw inspiration from. I come from the reading Karl Marx and having a critical worldview of what is property, what is private property. How can you privatize a forest? Who has entitlement to what? Is it a birthright? And a lot of these things are evident in the caste system. So if you're anti-casteist and you say, I'm a Sikh and I'm anti-casteist, you must be anti this idea that someone is given a birthright. Someone is given a birthright to be in a certain position of power or political kind of influence, or have an entitlement over land and ownership of people, of labor, of resources, and all these things like that. There are loads of things in our the way that we live now that are complete constructs that only continue to kind of perpetuate poverty. And again, this goes to this idea that I think you spoke with Shabbat last time on this podcast about how we are constructing a Sikh identity now, especially currently, post 1984 and post 2001, where we're really constructing this Sikh charitable image of who we are. And it's a complete construct, but it's plastering, it's literally just bandaging these institutional and top-down models that continue and perpetuate our own oppression. And I think you can maybe feed some people here and there, and you can do this, but the actual praxis of implementing a radical revolution in terms of like uprooting systems, which is inherently Sikhi in its history, challenging the structures of powers that exist, and understanding the frameworks and diagnosing those, right? As opposed to maybe just plastering here or there, donating here or there, offering solidarity here or there, online activism and all these things like that. What does praxis look like? This is someone, Paulo Freire, who wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, writes about a lot, is what do these things look like in practice, and how do we kind of challenge injustices, like in especially in the educational sense, and what do our educational systems do? Do we, and that's why when you have, for example, Sikhs that join the British Army and then they're stationed in Iraq, and we celebrate that, they're killing innocent people for the private property. We know this is a war about oil and natural resources and the kind of domination of the markets and things like this, and how this is perpetuated. And of course, people don't want to look into those conversations because it challenges their visual identity of what it means to be a Sikh, and it's a perversion of what their perception of reality is, and it's difficult to digest. And all I would encourage to your readers is to have that understanding, that outlook on what is currently happening in the world frameworks, and how radically different that is from the Guru's times, and especially after Industrial Revolution, and how we must really radically rethink or have a stance on things as a Sikh community or as individuals and the Sangat. Can the Gurdwaras come together and say, look, we're doing langar, but for fuck's sake, can we start talking about austerity? Can we hold the government account to austerity measures? Austerity is like the worst thing that has happened to Britain, like these last 10 years. The post 2008 financial crisis and the amount of destitution that's left in the country as a result of that, and the austerity measures that followed. Langar, people coming to langar is great, and we can celebrate that, but it's a symptom. In an ideal world, we don't want people to come to langar, and it's you probably, maybe some of your listeners are finding that hard to digest, but it's like this idea that, a firefighter, in an ideal world, we don't want firefighters in an ideal world. This idea that, we don't want these things to exist. We want to conform to its abolition. We want to end hunger, So having people coming to the langar is great, but it's a symptom of something else. People are coming to eat langar is a symptom, right? And I think we have to start going deeper in our conversations, deeper in our critical conversations and discourses. It's one of the reasons why I've got Professor Ronki Ram from Punjab University to talk about caste, because I'm not talking about Bhangra songs. I'm not talking about, caste jokes or like some, hashtag or social media posts. I'm talking about the agricultural landscape of Punjab that perpetuates caste. the Sikh missiles that perpetuate caste. The caste history and the notion of the Sikh Panth and the Singh Sabalair and all these things.
When you say Sikh missiles and caste, what do you mean in particular?
Just the consolidation of power and the consolidation of wealth, and what did that mean for, how did that result in the scheduled or lower caste Sikhs, and how did that come to their benefit or not, and how did they reproduce caste philosophies and so on.
Interesting. It'd be really, I'm looking forward to that. That'd be really interesting to know.
I mean, that's what I just want to, I want to direct conversations towards and discourses towards and encourage that and entertain that. Anyone that kind of has that kind of thinking, looking into structures and trying to fight for justice in any shape or form, whether it's historical, educational, physical, like social and political, economical justice, and conforming to that and seeing what that looks like in today's world. It's fine to understand, like it's difficult to help refugees and then at the same time endorse the military.
I think just a personal anecdote to share with you that I think encapsulates the mentality of a lot of Punjabi Sikh people. The reason we're in Britain is because our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents migrated at some point, or in the diaspora, they migrated at some point. And obviously, like everyone knows, like you actually commented about it earlier in terms of Blair Peach, the Southall riots, and all of the racism that Sikhs faced. Anyway, we were sat in a very close friend's house. Unfortunately, he's now passed away, but we were sat there, and this was at the time kind of there was a big influx of Eastern Europeans into England. And I remember him sitting there essentially just slagging off Romanians and being like, how dare they come to this country? They ain't got no jobs. They don't do this. Like the typical standard, like short-sighted criticisms that everyone kind of tries to throw out. And I was like, Uncle, don't you remember that you were once a Fuji? And he was like, oh yeah. And I'm like, well, how can you so quickly forget like the path you tread, and now all of a sudden you want to pick up that path because you don't want anyone else to tread on it? Like, what happened to the entire ideology of Sarbat Pala, let alone anything else? But like, what happened to that? And if you're coming over here for whatever economic benefit, whatever the case might be, like what or who has given you the right all of a sudden to restrict that for somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, with these anecdotes and things like that, again, this goes back to this idea that I mentioned very much early in the beginning of the conversation, that, we don't actually have free will. And then what I meant by that is that a lot of our opinions and a lot of the things that we're going to say, a lot of the things that we're going to do, a lot of the things that we kind of project our maybe emotions or project our opinions, or in those like anecdotes that you describe, a lot of that is derivative from environmental circumstances. So it could be maybe his colleagues, and he could be reproducing maybe what his colleagues are saying. He could reproduce what the Sun is saying. He could reproduce what BBC is telling him. He could reproduce, and of course these reproductions come with maybe other biases, with alignment to power and all those other things like that. Maybe there's some sort of social currency attached to having this opinion, right?
No, I don't disagree with that, and I think that's it's a really poignant point to make, because the context of why people make certain decisions is fantastic. However, I don't think that we can remove personal responsibility from it.
Yeah, and I think especially when it comes to conversations about accountability, and that's what I mean by, like what is reproducing, what is actually happening. And that's why I look into systems and understand that, the reason we look into systems is because if this is unfortunate because you said your friend passed away, but if people that hold these opinions or views and everything do pass away, then they will be reproduced because they will resurface. These opinions won't die, So for example, if every single racist disappears off this planet tomorrow, they will resurface in weeks and months and years to come, because that is what we are giving birth to, right? And that's the way the frameworks that have been set up or aligned to kind of, reproduce. I mean, there's a reason why we can't get rid of racism. There's a reason we can't get rid of casteism. There's a reason we can't get rid of sexism. There's a reason why inequality is like basically just a huge uphill climb, is simply because no matter how much you feed the poor, no matter like how much, even if you fed every single poor person today, gave them a full stomach, that these hunger or poverty or casteist or sexist or racist or all these other systems of discrimination and just this idea that all these other symptoms will just be resurfacing after weeks and months, and that's what I'm trying to get at when I talk about systems in particular.
No, I wouldn't disagree with that. Fair point. Just tying it back into Sikh Archive, we haven't necessarily delved into that much. We've spoken about a hell of a lot, but not necessarily kind of related, like, per se. So, first of all, where do you see Sikh Archive heading? Like, what is the overall objective? Obviously, you do these exhibitions that serve a really good purpose in terms of bringing out these kind of lesser known histories to the forefront and getting everyone to engage. Is that kind of the end game?
Well, it's more to it than that, because I think with Sikh Archive, it started off as a blog, a very trivial blog, sharing and sensationalizing images of Sikh history, of migration history, of religious history, of gendered history, and all these things, and in a complete random order, without any strategy. And that was like that for the first 2 years. That attracted a lot of supporters, and that attracted a lot of kind of mainstream thinking and kind of followship, where people would be attracted to it. It was sensationalized content, and I think we've gone far away from that. We've gone quite far from that in advancing this project. And then it became this idea of like, okay, now we've got this community on board on social media. Where can we kind of encourage longevity in the project? So we did Google Calendar, which reminds everyone what happened on this day in Sikh history. And I go through newspapers, I go through books, I go through all the archives, and I dig out significant dates of what happened, so that I can form a calendar. And it's a digital calendar. People subscribe to it, they can export it. It's on Google Calendar. It has a huge ton of data and a potential to be a very large project beyond me. And I think that's kind of the thing that I'm trying to get at here, is that anything that we should focus on Sikh Archive or any of these kind of projects, how does it exist beyond the administrator? How can it continue to survive? How can it continue to kind of have a lasting influence on people that are interested in Sikh history? So I think the calendar application certainly does that, and it's going to be there for pretty much forever, as long as Gmail lasts and as long as people are exporting and downloading this information. In the same spirit, these podcast episodes have a very, very long-lasting value, because they are lecture series on Sikh and Punjabi history, similar to like maybe the social utility or value that books have, but not everyone's reading. Some people prefer to be listening and want bite-sized information, or at least an introduction to the topic. I did a podcast with Mark Juergensmeyer about the Ravi Dasia. We scratched the surface of their history. We scratched the surface of his research, but what it will introduce people to is a goldmine of history, of how to understand and contextualize Sikh history. And I think, again, looking back on the longevity of these projects, I think, we're coming into this age of the digital era where we can store and mass this collection of catalogued information on Sikh and Punjabi history of the past, present, and future for a very long time in a secure way, and in a way that we can really lay the ground for the future. I mean, me and you, we're born in a generation where we lived both before social media. I mean, let's put it like this: we remember knocking up for people and asking if they wanted to play football, right? Yeah, and then we had PlayStations where you had to go around people's homes to play, like having to like basically invite friends around. So we've gone through this generation where before this digital revolution and slightly evolving into what it potentially can be. And I think we have a duty, therefore, to lay like some foundations for what Sikh history and Punjab history and storytelling and all these things look like in 10 or 20 or 100 years to come. Because I think, that's basically what this project is going to become.
I think you're right in terms of what it looks like. And I think just to add to what you're saying, I think the biggest importance of what you're doing is also how that relates to the individual. So for argument's sake, if I read like your calendar update and it says X, Y, and Z event happened on today, if I have no kind of connection with what I'm reading or no kind of understanding of kind of what's going on, it's just another historical fact. It's like another newspaper headline that I've read. But I think fundamentally the importance of the stuff you're doing is actually how that history, and especially some of those more untold histories, how they relate to people, social structures, the wider systems that kind of influence us.
Yeah, I mean, there are direct influences. I mean, you'll see a turban case in November 1988 or something, and then you find the same thing happening next year in another country in another year because they used the precedents on that case, and you might think it's unrelated, but it actually is. Or you see, for example, like something happened in Shirmuni Akali Dal politics in 1952. It happened on that day, and you're like, whoa, that could easily happen today. Or hang on, why does that mean, is that related to the farmer protests?
Well, I guess a good way of signifying that is actually going back to the start of the conversation we had, which is how the Japanese taking over Singapore directly impacted your family and like your history. And you're kind of like, well, actually, like you wouldn't necessarily connect those dots unless you were made aware and it was kind of brought in front of you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the calendar does that. It juxtaposes a lot of these histories that ran parallel, whether in time and space, to where we are today. And I think that's the most like interesting thing with the calendar, and again, the longevity of the project and what it means to be in a digital era and record Sikh and Punjabi history. And again, laying the foundations of like what it means. Like, I mean, our elders were writing books, right? Articles and pamphlets and leaflets. And then now our job is like, we're doing the social media pages, we're doing the kind of digital like record keeping and all those things like that. And God knows what, like, what the future will look like, but it's definitely that kind of like passing the baton, and I think loads of people are doing exhibitions and like curating exhibitions for general publics around the world and sharing what Sikhi is and sharing its history and understanding and doing pracharak and all these things like that. I mean, this idea about, Gurdwaras were really not that much of a thing in terms of like, there was a time when, we had historical Gurdwaras that we would go to and that would become a thing. Or then there was this huge proliferation of these Gurdwaras that came in the 20th century. And then, and now we're seeing like almost a redundancy in Gurdwaras. I mean, you can easily see that on how like Sikhi is being shaped on YouTube, like Basics of Sikh, and how maybe other social media pages, people find kind of Sikh sources and don't feel the need to go to Gurdwara, and in some respects becomes redundant. Our society and everything and Sikh Sangat is being radically transformed, and again is a symptom of our time, era, technology, and where we belong, what stage of which country we're born in. So what I'm trying to say is that what is Sikh Archive? Why is it important? Where is it going with the future? I think it's a checkpoint. That's what I would say. Yeah.
No, touche. I just wanted to ask one last question. I think it'd be a nice way to wrap up the podcast, which is we've spoken a lot about kind of the bigger systems, the kind of undercurrents that impact us and history on a day-to-day basis, perhaps that we're not even aware of. However, just bringing it back to like an individual basis, what would you like? Because you're someone who has taken something from a personal basis, constructed, kind of started out with just a bit of a whim, and then constructed something really powerful and amazing and inspirational. Because if I'm completely honest, you are probably 90% of the reason I restarted Ramblings. So if anyone wants to abuse me,
what, because I triggered you, yeah, with some much Sikh history storytelling?
No, not at all. Imagine if that was the case. No, not at all. I just think
you'd be like, you know what, fuck this guy.
I think that the thing that I really personally gelled with was the fact that you have the brass knuckles to engage with parts of history that I would personally say are quite not controversial in that you're finding controversial history, but it's controversial for wider society because it's questioning those norms, those kind of things we've got used to. So for argument's sake, I love the exhibition you're doing currently on Sikh women in history and how that works, because one thing that I found, and this is just from a completely like historical basis, is it's really difficult to find information about Sikh women, full stop. And I found information on Sikh women in history in really like random places. However, the question that I actually want to put to you, so what would you say to people listening, and especially kind of when I say the youth, because we're not that old, obviously we're old enough to have kids, but we're not that old. But in relation to kind of like teenagers, kids growing up, people who are kind of trying to perhaps find their like footing, what would you recommend to teenagers, kids, even adults, in terms of what can they do to engage with Sikh history, philosophy, and equally what can they do to perhaps perpetuate or kind of further the cause, so to speak?
Yeah, I'm gonna like pass the baton here, because one of the elders that I drew inspiration from when it comes to Sikh studies, or even why I started anything to do with Sikh blogging, or even reading Sikh history books, or getting a kind of understanding of Sikh history and anything like that, was from Harvinder Singh Mandir from Naujawani. He does these Sikh studies lecture courses, completely free, and they're 14-week courses where he'll give kind of an overview of Sikh history, and they're kind of really intimate kind of lectures, really kind of engaging, open questions, and long form discussions, maybe 2 hours, where we discuss maybe from Guru Nanak to current day Sikh Sangat community and migration and so on. We're talking about the missals, we're talking about the Guru periods, we're talking about Maharaja Ranjit Singh, we're talking about partition, we're talking about the British influence on Sikhi, and it's a really interesting 14-week lecture. But by the end of it, what's really interesting is that the 14th lesson, I think it could be the 13th, I think it's the 14th. The 14th lesson it's not a lesson, it's a whole kind of workshop dedicated for us to bounce ideas of what we're going to do. And I think his philosophy is, and his very supportive philosophy is, do something. Like it could be anything, and it makes more and more sense the older I get. The older I get, the more sense I can see in those words, because people like yourself, like you're doing a podcast, right? I'm doing a podcast, but we have completely different focuses, and we are bouncing off each other. We're sharing resources, we discover each other, we inspire each other. There are so many consequences that are so far beyond what you may be aware of if you simply do something. Now there's a few uncles in North America, I'm talking like USA and Canada, who have like this energy and this drive to do things. And I'm not always on board with it, let's be honest, yeah, because it's militaristic or it's something, yeah. But the fact that they're doing something like that, and it invokes a reaction in one of us to do something, is the whole aim of the game, right? And like I said, the more older I get, the more sense Harvinder Singh Mandir's words made to me when he says like, do something, and just have an active part or role in anything. You could be an artist, you could be a musician, you could be a blogger, you could be a writer, you could be a sports star, you can be a bhangra dancer, whatever you're doing something because you're encouraging, you're exciting the discourse on something. And I don't mean go out there and do controversial things. I just mean generally that for any person, anything is going to be controversial, no matter what you do. No matter what you say, you're going to get criticism no matter what, just go ahead and do it. And, so what I'm trying to say is that my advice to other people would simply be that. And I'm just passing on that advice, what I was given, or what I came to those realizations, is actually just to do something. There is me just documenting the Sikhs of Denmark here, or just starting Sikh Archive has had, like I said, if I didn't do Sikh Archive, maybe that wouldn't bring you back in the game, or something like that. And that was just me. And that's one of many consequences of having the Sikh Archive page, or me coming into Denmark and going to the Gurdwara and asking the Pradhan, Uncle ji, ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕੌਣ ਆਏ ਸੀ, ਕਦੋਂ ਆਏ ਸੀ, ਕਿਉਂ ਆਏ ਸੀ, ਸੰਗਤ ਕਦੋਂ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ, ਗੁਰਦੁਆਰਾ ਕਦੋਂ ਬਣਿਆ? Just asking those questions and doing that one step and led to the fruition of the museum and the exhibition project, because I was taking a fascination. Just simply doing something has a huge chain of events that sometimes is visible and sometimes it's not. I'm sure that your book reviews are reaching people widely and coming to their own kind of realizations of who they are and what this means to them and how they reproduce or pass that baton on. And I think doing something just does that. I mean, we have, like, let's say, for example, now you have gay Sikhs and all strength to them at this time. I mean, they're pushing boundaries in what our discourse is currently on the topic. And it tests a lot of people. It encourages a lot of people. And again, like I said, solidarity and all strength to them, because they push the limits of the conversations to be further for the furtherance of the discourse on what does Sikh discourse look like. It could be any topic. Sometimes it's something you're not even doing, but if you are visually or projecting or doing something in some sense, being part of it, engaging or demonstrating or protesting or being present. Sometimes being present somewhere, just like, for example, having someone in attendance, just going somewhere to listen to something can really maybe even offer the speaker confidence of something that, this Singh or this core has come to attend, or it just has a monumental chain of events that sometimes, again, are visible or invisible. But by just doing something, even just producing artwork, and maybe it's not good artwork, or maybe it's not good poetry, but that contributes to the ether of poetry, right? The ether of work that is contributed to Sikh literature. And because, when I dig through newspapers, archival material, do you know how much stuff make the papers, and how trivial it might have been at the time, but how much value it has in the future? Like you'll have a story, there's photographers in Birmingham, I think it was in Handsworth, that took photographs of minorities like West Indian and Punjabi migrants, and these Singhs or something just attended, and they got their photos taken. And it was probably the most trivial thing in the world for them. Just crossing, maybe somewhere in Handsworth, and a photographer wants to take a photo. But then it's in books now, the Sikhs of Britain book, or it's in all the newspapers, or it's it's used on Sikh Archive 40, 50 years later, or it's rediscovered and it's put on exhibitions. And it has such a lasting effect of what impact we can have. Journalists are like the first drafters of history. And I think, when we make the papers, when we do anything or everything, there is we leave a footprint on this, on this world scale of history in time and space. And I think just by doing something, by attending, going to work, or being part of something, attending a lecture, that gives a lecture confidence that their material means something. Even if you're just listening, or that you bump shoulders with someone that has a similar worldview and has a similar passion for something, or that you decide to create or curate some art or poetry or music or an exhibition or a blog, or you become, something. I think it just has a huge, it's a huge complex dynamical system of how much influence or how much how much we can project onto others. And I think Sikh Archive blog does that in some way, because there are many people that reach out and say, so for example, I just shared Nikki Ganinda Kaur's Singh's book, and no one knew a lot. Well, I wouldn't say no one. I say a lot of people just didn't know it existed, and they've just been saying, "We're buying it now." and we didn't know there was this feminine energy or feminist interpretation of Sikhi at such a scholarly level. And you know how much, like, even scholarly work, there's a lot of gatekeeping there. People don't have access to it, you know, and just making that comment is having a huge impact on people. Again, right or wrong, you know, we take for example Harjot Singh Oberoi's book, right or wrong, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, the amount of work and literature that it gave rise to in criticism only strengthened the Sikh history scholarly work. It only strengthened it, and it only became stronger. Whether or not, again, agree or disagree with his work, the monumental impact he's had on others to become actively engaged in the discourse to prove him wrong, or however you want to see it, prove him right, prove him wrong, whatever, has only birthed a much greater movement. And it was only because he chose to do something, you know. And I think that's 9 times out of 10, that's the case, where if you want to do something and it's people have conflicting opinions or whatever, you know, so be it. It's just strengthening both your arguments or whatever.
No, completely. Well, just to round up, so essentially what you're saying is do something, even if it's Bangla, because it will help in one way or another. Shout out also to Noor Jawani and Harvinder, because I think that philosophy is actually pretty brilliant, because irrespective of whether you agree or disagree, the end goal is still, it's constructive. We're simply just trying to engage, re-engage, and keep going to just help further one another's understanding. That's a really nice way of perhaps ending the podcast, because that's essentially what you're doing. It's essentially what I'm doing. We're just doing the little bit that we think might make a difference. Whether it does or not, who knows? I hope it does. Whether one person listens to the podcast or a million people, like, as long as it makes a difference to somebody, I guess that's all that matters, really.